All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to week number 3 of MPA 623. Hope everyone's week is off to a good start. Before we get into our information for tonight, I know we'll have several more folks joining us along the way. Let me just first thank you for your Canvas essay. I've gone through all those that were turned in and provided some feedback on those. I thought, again, your comparison between public and private organizations, the comparison was done very well. The essays were well written. So again, just keep up the good work on those Canvas essays. Then, as you all know, your background paper is due by 11:59 p.m. tonight. I've received several of them already. Any paper that was turned in before about 5 o'clock today, I've been able to get to and review and then send back some feedback. The way in which I'm handling the feedback is I am using the annotation feature in the inline grading. And so you'll see the little blue mark there, and then you'll see my comment. If I had any edits or comments to put in the paper, I use those annotations in the inline grading. Otherwise, then I just provided you with some feedback in the feedback box, a couple paragraphs, just commenting on your problem that you are discussing in the paper, the job you did discussing that problem. And then, if there's anything I could, add to kind of augment the discussion, I did that as well. But so far, so good. I think I've got about a dozen of those papers in. And again, the grades are trending very high on those papers, which is absolutely fine with me. It's just indicative of the outstanding job I think everyone's doing so far in the course. So if you haven't turned in that background paper yet, please do make sure to get that turned in by, again, 11:59 p.m. tonight. I have carved out, even though I teach a class on Tuesdays, I've carved out a few hours on Tuesday afternoon where hopefully I'll be able to get to all the rest of the background papers and get those papers back to you with feedback if all goes well by sometime late tomorrow night. And if not by late tomorrow night, I'll definitely have them back for you by Wednesday, probably sometime Wednesday morning. So trying to get those turned around and back to you as quickly as possible. So where are we at now in the class? In week 3, our primary topic for tonight is a look at the environment, both outside as well as within our organizations, and what those environmental characteristics and factors mean for effectiveness. Now, moving forward then, as we go through the rest of this week, you know that you would then have another Canvas essay that is due next week, and that Canvas essay for next week is a pretty easy one for you. Shouldn't take you a whole lot of time because you're just essentially taking part of your background paper and then posting that in the discussion area. And so what I'm asking you to do for the next Canvas essay is to just tell us again about your issue or problem that you used for the topic of your background paper. Just tell us what that issue or problem is, where that issue or problem came from, why that issue or problem is important for effectiveness. And again, just kind of distill what you did in your background paper down to a few paragraphs and make that then your next Canvas essay. And then next week, when we get together in week 4, we'll then move into a discussion of missions and goals and strategic planning and how all those good things have impacts upon effectiveness. But for tonight, our primary topic is going to be, again, the environment, looking at the external and the internal environment and what types of characteristics and features of both the external as well as the internal environment, what those characteristics and features, their impact they have on, again, effectiveness. So the way in which I'd like to do tonight's session is, again, as I do all of the sessions together, the first half of the class will present and discuss some of this information about the environmental analysis, both external as well as internal. Then we'll take a break, and then after our break, we'll come back and we'll do our breakout groups where you'll apply some of the information we talked about in the first half of class tonight to your specific organizations. So that's where we are. That is our plan of attack for this evening. So any questions or anything at all before we get into our discussion of environmental analysis? Okay. As always, to participate, feel free to go through the class tonight. I'll be asking you some questions and asking you to provide and share some examples from your experience. And as always, you can use text chat. I've got the chat box open for you. or you could also use your microphone to participate as well. But let's start our discussion of environmental analysis by looking at the external environment and what types of characteristics in the external environment can then have an impact upon effectiveness. And again, there are a lot of different characteristics in an environment that can impact effectiveness. I think it was last week or the week before that, I made mention to John Gauss and talked about the ecology of public administration and this belief that we can only really understand public organizations and the behaviors of public servants if we understand the environment in which those individuals and those organizations exist. That's the ecology of public administration. So when we look outside the walls of our organization, we look at our environment, there are some salient characteristics in the environment that can impact upon effectiveness. One salient environmental characteristic we need to be concerned about is capacity. And by capacity, we're talking about the capacity of the environment to adequately support the organization. Now, organizations all want to survive. Agency survival is a primary motivator of a lot of public agencies. So the question then becomes, is our environment capable? Does it have the capacity necessary to help support this agency and help this agency survive? So when we think about the capacity of the environment, we could be looking at a lot of different types of resources in the environment that we need in our organizations. Things such as a stable workforce. So we need our environment to provide us with a stable and well-qualified workforce so that we can do the staffing function in our organizations. If we have an organization where it's primarily staffed by engineers, and in our local environment, we do not have an engineering program or any program that trains engineers, our environment may struggle to provide us with the types of employees that we need to adequately staff our organization. So certainly we need our environment to support our agencies in terms of that staffing function. But what other aspects of environmental capacity do you think are important for organizations beyond just personnel? What else is important in terms of the capacity of the environment?
This is Kyle. So for me as an employee of LA County Parks, land is a capacity. Land is an issue for us. So one thing the department is really proud of is that we're building a new regional park on what was a landfill. So using land in creative ways because the land in LA is such a commodity.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Con. That's an excellent example. Yeah, the land is very much a commodity, especially in certain areas of LA. And so repurposing land in order to be able to carry out your functions as a department. Excellent example. Funding, as Julie says, funding is another excellent example. Does the environment provide the level of funding that we need in order to be able to pay our employees and to be able to implement our programs and deliver our goods and services? Resources to do the job, having cross-training policies, partnerships, all part of that capacity. We know that in our environment, we have a lot of different moving parts. We don't just have a legislature to deal with, but we also have citizens we need to satisfy. We have other agencies that we need to deal with. We have private sector corollary types of agencies in the private sector that may not be providing the same functions and duties that we are doing in our organization, but they're kind of similar that they're doing in the private sector. So partnerships with those private sector organizations, partnerships with nonprofit organizations obviously are very important to help expand the amount of resources that we have to carry out our daily functions. So I think certainly all those are part of that capacity. Another aspect of capacity you can think about is support, political support. How much political support do we have in our environment, and how much political support does the environment able to give us? And if we don't have the political support, then we may not be able to get the funding levels that we need, or get access to the land that we need to repurpose for the functions of our organization. So capacity is basically, can the environment support the agency adequately? Homogeneity versus heterogeneity in the environment is also an important characteristic for organizations to consider. And so when you think about, homogeneity or heterogeneity of opinions, and homogeneity and heterogeneity of, things that the members of the society and the environment want to see from this organization. And so is there agreement about what this organization should be doing? Do you have, very few different opinions about what the role and the job of the organization is? You have homogeneity in terms of that type of opinion. There's a lot of heterogeneity in that you've got all these different demands and all these different requests coming into your organization from a variety of different sources in your environment. Clearly, the more heterogeneous the demands being placed upon your organization, the more difficult it may be for your organization to come up with a clear definition of what is considered to be effective. Because what's effective for one segment of your environment may not be effective for another segment of your environment. Stability versus turbulence of the environment. How stable versus how dynamic is your environment? If you're in a very stable environment where you have a stable flow of resources, so you get your resources through appropriations, those appropriations that are flowing through the legislative body are relatively stable. And they may change by 1 or 2 or 3% per year, but they've been pretty stable for many, many years. If you have that type of stability, then sometimes your strategies can be relatively stable and static as well. Sometimes you're working in a very turbulent environment where you have a lot of turnover going on among elected officials, and you have new, parties coming in and dominating, the executive branch, or dominating the legislative branch. When you've got that type of turmoil and that type of turbulence, you're going to have to be a lot more adept at responding to those changes in your environment, much more so than if you were in a static environment. So how stable, how turbulent is that environment that you are dealing with? Whenever there is a crisis, like a COVID-19 pandemic, that introduces a lot of turbulence into your environment. And so the old answers that may have worked pre-pandemic are not working during a pandemic. It won't work post-pandemic either. And so you have to be a lot more flexible in order to adapt to those types of changes that you're facing as a result of a crisis. Concentration versus dispersion of resources within your environment. If you're getting your resources primarily from appropriations from a legislative body, then you have a great deal of concentration. You know where those resources are coming from. You know who the primary players are in making those funding decisions. You know where to go to appeal your case, concentrated types of resources. Contrast that to if you are a nonprofit organization that gets the vast majority of your budget from grants. That's going to be a lot of dispersion of resources. You're going to be applying to different grants from different types of organizations in your environment to be a lot more difficult for you to generate adequate revenue in order to do your functions. And consensus versus dissensus. So how much agreement is there about the value and the worth of your organization and the value and worth of what you are doing as an organization? Do people value what's going on in the organization? Is there consensus that yes, this organization is important, and yes, these programs that are being delivered by this organization are important as well? So just generally, those are some of the different categories of characteristics of our environment that we need to be concerned about as an organization, and then adjust our operations accordingly in order to meet those different characteristics. And one of the things that we'll talk about tonight is throughout our entire understanding, the development of our understanding of the role the environment plays on effectiveness. One thing that we have learned is that today we take a much more situational, much more contingency-based approach to how our organizations relate to their environment than we did maybe 100 or 150 years ago. And we realize that, as Mary Parker Follett will tell us, we lead by situation. and we need to understand the context of the situation in which we are dealing currently in order to know the most appropriate way to interface and interact with our external environment. We know this external environment in which we operate is a politically charged external environment. And again, as we had talked about before, we differentiate between public and private organizations. One of the major points we used as differentiation was the political aspect of public administration. Woodrow Wilson told us that politics will always serve as the touchstone of our administration. So whatever we do in administration, whatever reforms we implement or changes we make to the way in which we are administering programs to try and be more effective, we always need to remember politics. We always need to go back to politics as a touchstone of what we're doing in administration. So this politics administration dichotomy, as I'm sure you've covered several times in the program at this point in time, we know this politics administration dichotomy is not a clear break. It's not a clear distinction, because we are doing our administrative work in very much of a political world. So in this political environment, as we know, we have a lot of political actors that we have to interface with. We have to interface with the legislative body. Legislative bodies are inherently political. So we know that in order to curry favor, in order to be able to get legislators to trust us and to respect what our agencies are doing, we have to respond from demands that are placed upon us by legislators. And one of the major demands that a legislator will place upon an agency is a demand for casework. So a constituent calls up a member of Congress or a member of the state legislature, says, I'm not getting this benefit that I am owed. So that member will then go and contact the administrative agency and say, help out my constituent. Go and investigate their case, find out why they are not getting what they feel they need to get out of your agency. That type of casework is something we do a lot in administration in order to respond to those types of demands that are being placed upon us by legislators. So again, we're doing some of that political work for legislators, because by doing that casework, those legislators can then enhance their reelection prospects, as David Mayhew would tell us. And so it benefits them, and so they'll look more kindly upon agencies that help them with those types of casework requests. So the legislature obviously is going to be a very political type of actor that we have to deal with. Executive branch is also going to be a political actor as well. And we know different chief executives take different approaches to how they interact with the bureaucracy and how they interact with public agencies. There's a very good article that was written just a few months ago that looked at the role of governors as chief executives in the COVID-19 pandemic. It's an article called Governors in Control. And it's an article that you can find in a journal called Publius, Journal of Federalism. Excellent article, because it really talked about how chief executives, governors, have really become much more active in the pandemic through orders and mandates that they are passing down to agencies. And now agencies are being required to be much more responsive to the chief executive, to the governor, than they are to be responsive to legislative bodies like they were in the past. And so whenever you see this shift of I hate to say power, but the shift of focus during a crisis to the chief executive, then that makes this relationship between the chief executive and agencies even more important. And we saw through the COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Newsom handing down these orders and these mandates that directly affected how state agencies and local agencies operated and went about their daily business. It's not unusual to see the focus of responsibility shift to the chief executive during a time of crisis. It just makes rational sense when you think about the immediacy of the situation. And if you're looking at how quickly a legislative body can respond to a crisis compared to a chief executive, it's clear the chief executive can respond a lot quicker. You've got one person, the chief executive, whether it be a president or a governor, versus dozens and dozens of people in the state legislature. Much more difficult to get that, those 80 people or those 40 people, depending whether you're talking about the assembly or the state senate, get them all moving in one direction as opposed to one singular governor. The judiciary is another important actor in our environment. And we sometimes get a little uncomfortable when we talk about the judiciary as a political actor. But we know that, even more so today than the past, we've seen a lot of judicial activism. And we've seen judges who are responding oftentimes in line with an ideology or with a partisan affiliation, much more discernible than it's been in the past. We've seen the judicial branch courts issue things like structural remedies, where they will require agencies to take certain types of actions in order to remedy a situation. So someone brings a case to the courts and says, this agency is doing something that is violating my constitutional rights. So you think about something like education funding. And so people will sue over education funding and say that these districts are not spending enough money per pupil to make education equal across the entire state. So then the court will come in, oftentimes the state Supreme Court, and will tell those districts, you need to generate more money and spend more money on your pupils. And for every day you do not raise more money and spend more money, we are going to fine your district. That's a structural remedy where the courts are saying, this is something you need to do, and we're going to hold you accountable for doing it. William, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question because when I saw the judiciary as a political actor, I don't know if I will necessarily call it a political actor. Maybe I'm wrong, but because like you mentioned, if it goes to the Supreme Court is not going to rule towards the Democrats or Republican. It's going to rule towards the rule of the law, meaning interpreting the Constitution and how we work better serves the public. So is that considered political, or you just doing, because to me, the judges should be completely beyond politics in general. Even when it comes to budgeting and stuff like that, typically they just follow the rule. That's why, like, right now we're hearing the whole issue with the new judge that we're gonna get this and that. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the person looks like. It's just matter how it will interpret the law, which is what matters, not politics.
We would hope. That's in theory in the classroom, that's what you would hope. But in reality, it's not necessarily the way. And when you look at the Supreme Court, you look at the different eras of the Supreme Court, whether you're looking at the Burger Court or the Warren Court or the Rehnquist Court or now the Roberts Court, you do see ideology having an impact upon the decisions rendered by the court. We do have a liberal wing of the Supreme Court, and we have a conservative wing of the Supreme Court. The conservative wing of the Supreme Court outnumbers the liberal wing of the Supreme Court now, because you had some conservative justices Barrett, and you had Brett Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, who were somewhat recently nominated and confirmed to the Supreme Court, which really does swing the Supreme Court to the conservative side. And we've seen more and more conservative types of decisions coming out of the court. And we saw the same type of thing only on the opposite side of the spectrum when we were looking at some of the rulings of the court in the 1960s. When you look at some of the rulings in the court in the 1960s, you see some of those rulings that really expanded things such as constitutional rights of defendants. And so you had things like, Miranda versus Arizona and your Miranda rights. We saw the expansion of protection against double jeopardy in the Benton versus Maryland case. There's a whole series of cases in the 1960s that were kind of coming out from a more liberal type of orientation of the court. In the 1990s, we saw a lot of cases coming out that were really fueled by a states' rights type of perspective, because again, you had more of a conservative type of majority in the court that was kind of turning out those states' rights types of cases. So I think it's true, as it's discussed in text chat, and like we said, in theory, we would hope that the Supreme Court would be blind in terms of politics and ideology. But we do know that today, as Enrique says, sadly, it has become more politicized and more ideological than perhaps we would hope that it would have been. But ideology always plays a role.
But wouldn't the issues that you discuss about the Supreme Court, if we look at historically, have to do more with the intentions of the country as a whole and how people are reacting to certain stuff? Because let's say an example, if we look at, I forgot which case was brought to the Supreme Court during Trump's era, but everybody thought that Copernic, I think it was the last Supreme Judge that Trump assigned, was going to vote in favor of Trump, and he actually voted against it, because regardless of who put him in there, it was about what was right according to the law, not necessarily who was your boss, even though that the Supreme Court doesn't have a boss. So would it be more like what is happening as an environment, like we were discussing earlier, the whole environment, and the Supreme Court has to pretty much make judgments based on the law and the environment? And we see how the environment has changed over decades, and that is being projected in the new rulings that we see, not necessarily that the judge is more conservative or more liberal.
I would argue no. I would argue, unfortunately, the reality is that there is a conservative and there is a liberal side of the court. I think we'd be naive to say that when judgments are made, when decisions are made by the U.S. Supreme Court, that those decisions are completely devoid of ideological orientation. I wish they would be, but unfortunately they're not. And yes, the Supreme Court's supposed to rule on the constitutionality, but we have seen the Supreme Court move away from their traditional standard is stare decisis. It's reliance upon precedent. But there have been several cases over the past few years where the court has turned away from precedent in the past from previous courts and have ruled a different way because there's a different orientation ideologically on the court. And when you go back, and it is true that sometimes presidents will nominate, will appoint, and have someone confirmed to the court thinking that justice will be a very conservative or very liberal justice, and then they surprise the president. And in some cases, they vote opposite to what the president thought they were voting. The president is very frustrated with that. That does happen on occasion. That happened a bit with Sandra Day O'Connor is a great example. Sandra Day O'Connor was a big advocate of states' rights, but she was also a big advocate of expansion of civil liberties and civil rights. And so sometimes they were a little surprised. President Reagan was a little surprised whenever he would see the way in which Sandra Day O'Connor would write an opinion, craft an opinion, not in the way in which he thought that she would normally do it. But I do think it is ideological, and I think it's hard for us to look at the court and the liberal versus conservative sides of the court and not see that playing out very profoundly in a lot of their decisions that they're writing. So, there's what we would like to see, and there's what we actually do see. When we devolve that down to the state level, I think we see that even more at the state level. Especially when we get into state courts and we get into some elected positions, then you get even more of a partisan ideological element coming out of the judiciary. So I think there is that ideological partisan element that I think we have to acknowledge in the courts. And it's not new. I think it's kind of pronounced today, but it's not new. I mean, you can go back 200 years and look at the Supreme Court, and you have members of the court that were bitter political rivals of presidents. And you can see that reflected in some of their decisions that they wrote while they were on the Supreme Court. I know we've got some comments and text chats. Let me go back and see. Judges are supposed to be neutral. You vow to be neutral, not always are. So it's the reality versus perception. Desire for tenure. Yeah, when you've got people who are there for life, you can't really remove them very readily. They kind of have a lot more independence. You would hope that independence would lead to a break from ideology and a break from partisanship. But again, talk to anyone who studies the Supreme Court, and one of the first things they will talk about is the conservative versus liberal wings of the court. And again, we're trying to find a balance between those two wings. Right now, the conservative wing is certainly much stronger than the liberal wing. That's one of the reasons why Stephen Breyer, for months leading up to Stephen Breyer's announcement of his impending retirement, you had Democrats who were asking him to retire and saying, please retire now while you're in the Biden administration, so President Biden can then nominate a more liberal justice to replace you, since you are already a liberal justice, so the liberal justices don't lose another seat on the Supreme Court. So again, it's that reality that it is partisan at times, and it is ideological, even coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court, even more so once you get down to the state level with state judges. So again, you've got all three of the branches of government that have influence being placed upon your organization, and that's all part of this dynamic environment that we have to deal with. We also have other agencies in the bureaucracy that we have to deal with as well. Sometimes when we have agencies combating other agencies, you have turf wars. So there are two agencies that are delivering very similar programs or goods and services. You'll see those two agencies get into a turf war with each other, and you've got that type of competition that you have to deal with as well. Michael, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, in addition to the different agencies that might be competing, another thing to consider, I think I actually replied to somebody's forum post about this last week, is that some of us have equivalents in the private sector, so you may actually have to compete with them. So whatever headwind or tailwind they may be experiencing at the time will definitely influence, well, how much pull our given agency might be. I think the one I was replying to was Parker, it might have been Kyle actually, was a Park and Recs guy, and they had to compete with private recreational fields like golf courses and stuff like that. So it may depend on how that private industry is doing, or what sort of rules are going on for the private industry within a given state.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great point. It's not just other public agencies, it's private agencies that are delivering similar types of services to what our public agencies delivering. You think about, that was a great example. You think about, recreation center. If you have a recreation center that's being operated by the city, it's going to be competing with other privately owned recreation centers, whether it be LA Fitness or whatever. And so you've got that type of competition where you're delivering similar types of services to your constituents, just one is public and one is private. So that's another influence from the environment. So it's an excellent point. I see Natalie in text chat asked a question about constitutional originalist versus non-originalist justice playing into the conservative versus liberal viewpoints. Another good point, because we have some judges who are they call themselves originalists, and they say the Constitution is the Constitution, and so therefore we shouldn't do a lot of interpretation of the Constitution that could substantially change the meaning of a lot of the provisions in the Constitution. Then you have other judges who say, well, the Constitution was written to be a living, dynamic document. After all, Article 5 of the Constitution lays out for us ways in which we can amend the Constitution. It gives us 4 different ways to amend the Constitution. So after all, would the framers have given us Article 5 and how to amend the Constitution if we weren't supposed to amend the Constitution to bring it in alignment with current society? And you're right, that's a big debate that goes on in courts all the time, and it does oftentimes follow along conservative and liberal ideologies, where more conservative justices tend to be more constitutional originalists, whereas more liberal justices or judges tend to favor a more dynamic living interpretation of the Constitution. We have only amended the Constitution 27 times in over 200 years. And 10 of those amendments all came all at once, in 1791 with the Bill of Rights. And so we don't amend the Constitution a lot, but we do make amendments to the Constitution. Now, you can certainly change the Constitution without amendments through interpretation. And so, give you an example. The one I always like to use is the example of protection against double jeopardy. So we know we have in the Fifth Amendment protection against double jeopardy, that we cannot be tried twice for the same crime. That was, under its original interpretation by the Supreme Court, that was a protection that only extended to include the national government. So only the national government was precluded from trying someone for the same crime twice. Now, in later cases, the Supreme Court decided, well, that actually should include state governments too. And so state government should not be able to try you for the same crime twice. And there was a very famous case in 1937 called Palco versus Connecticut, where a gentleman was found guilty. Well, he was found not guilty of murder. State of Connecticut then retried him on the same crime with all the same evidence, a different jury, and got a guilty verdict on him. He complained to the Supreme Court. Case went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court and said, the Fifth Amendment says I have protection against double jeopardy. Supreme Court in 1937 said, sorry, that's protection against the national government only. It doesn't extend to protection against the state government trying you for the same crime twice. Then it took 30 years, all the way until 1968, in a case called Benton versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court said, well, double jeopardy protection should include state government action as well. That's an example of interpreting the Constitution, in a different way in 1968 than the court interpreted the Constitution in 1937. And again, that was the way in which you can interpret the Constitution without writing a new amendment and adding a new amendment to the Constitution. We also, not to get too far into the weeds on this, but sometimes the U.S. Supreme Court can change its opinion relatively quickly. And in the world of federalism, there's an example of a case in 1976 called National League of Cities versus Usury versus a case in 1985 called Garcia versus San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority. And to just cut to the chase very quickly, both cases revolved around the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Congress trying to impose minimum wage requirements on state and local employees. In 1976, in National League of Cities versus Usury, state and local government said, you cannot tell us what to pay our employees because we're sovereign entities, and it's an essential function of government for us to determine how much to pay our employees. You can tell the private sector, but we're sovereign entities, the state and local governments, and you can't impose these requirements upon us. Supreme Court agreed in 1976 and said, yes, what you pay your employees, that is an essential function of government. Then 9 years later, in 1985, the Supreme Court then had another case, pretty much the same exact brief of the case, same exact details of the case in Garcia versus SAMTA, where once again, Congress tried to extend minimum wage requirements to state and local employees. State and local employees again cried foul and said, back in 1976, you gave us protection against this. Well, in 1985, when the court had the Garcia case, they said, we made a mistake in 1976. We erred by saying this is an essential function of government. We're Supreme Court justices. We don't know what an essential function of state and local government is. That's something that's beyond our experience to be able to comment upon. And so therefore, we can't say it's an essential function. So we're not going to give you protection against that. Congress can do what it wants in that regard. That's a 9-year difference between 1976 and 1985. The only real difference is we had a little turnover in the court, and we had some different justices come in to replace justices who had retired, and that different composition of the court gave us a completely different interpretation on the same issue 9 years later. Let's see, Amber, I was under the impression that U.S. constitutional law is amended via statutory law. Yeah, we do. We change constitutional interpretations all the time. So we don't change the wording of the Constitution, but what we will do is we'll change our interpretation through statute. And by changing that interpretation, it kind of has the functional equivalency sometimes of a true amendment, but we're not actually changing the wording of the Constitution. We've only actually had true amendments 27 times so far. The most recent one, the 27th Amendment, ratified in 1992. And don't get me started on the 27th Amendment, because that's a really interesting case. First proposed by James Madison. It was supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights, never got ratified until 1992. So kind of a really strange case of amending the Constitution. We also know that in our external environment, we have interest groups, and interest groups play a role. They don't only lobby Congress, but they also get involved in the rulemaking process. And we know that in the bureaucracy and administrative agencies, we write a lot of rules to govern the implementation of legislation, and interest groups are keenly aware of that. And so interest groups try to interject themselves into that rulemaking type of process, having some direct contact with administrators as they write those rules for implementation. And then obviously the mass media. And the mass media is our watchdog of what goes on in the bureaucracy and public agencies. And so, again, a very varied and oftentimes political environment that we have to deal with as public administrators, much more political and much more varied environment than our private sector counterparts have to deal with. So as we try and define effectiveness, we have to be mindful of all these different characteristics of our environment. We also have to be mindful of what the legislature tells us effectiveness is for our organizations and for our programs. Sometimes there will be clues in legislation as to what a measure of effectiveness will be. And if that legislation has that clue to here is what effectiveness is defined as for this program, then we need to abide by that definition of effectiveness. And so the decisions being made by the legislature as opposed to being directly made by the organization. And we have executive orders that come out of the executive branch from the chief executive that, again, can have a profound impact upon how we define and how we measure effectiveness in our organizations. So when we define and measure effectiveness, we have to be very concerned about this heterogeneous, very dynamic, and oftentimes very political external environment. But we also need to be very concerned about the internal environment as well. And we need to recognize that there's an environment inside of our organizations. And that environment in our organizations, that internal environment, can also have an impact upon how we measure and how we define effectiveness. Now, when we talk about this internal environment within the walls of our organization and the impact of this internal environment on our definition and measurement of effectiveness, we, by definition, are going to be talking about some of these organization theories that you have probably been introduced to before in a previous class, and you will certainly talk about again in your next class in the program. So let's just kind of look at how we have developed different definitions of what effectiveness is in terms of the internal structure of our organizations, and how we've gone through an evolution, if you will, and a development of our understanding of this internal environment and how we can utilize this internal environment to make our organizations effective. Now, when you were first exposed to organization theory literature, you probably started your discussion with what we call the classical school of organization theory. And the classical school of organization theory, the classical view of organization theory really looks at on a macro level. So on a macro level, it's looking at how do we define effectiveness for the organization. Our focus is more on the effectiveness and the health of the organization itself as an institution, as opposed to individual members and participants in that organization. When you talk about the classical school, you usually start with a discussion of Max Weber. And so tell me a little bit about Max Weber, what you remember about Max Weber and what his primary theories were. Anybody talk about Max Weber? Does it ring a bell, Max Weber and the ideal bureaucracy?
Does it have to do with the systematic view?
Yeah, well, sure, yeah. And Max Weber really believed that we could come up with kind of a one way to structure our organization, one system we can put in place that will make our organizations effective. Max Weber really believed in the power of empiricism. He believed that we could collect information, generate and collect information, and use that information to then make our organizations effective. He really believed very much in rationality. And his empirical rationality kind of boiled down to his theory known as the ideal bureaucracy. So Weber would argue to us in this classical school that to make our organizations effective, we could structure our organization according to this ideal bureaucratic structure. And according to Weber, the ideal bureaucratic structure, the most effective bureaucratic structure, is one that values things such as division of labor. So we divide the work up in our organization. By dividing the work up among several different members and units in our organization, we can be more effective and more efficient. We do a lot of division of labor every single day in our modern organizations. So you divide up the work. Second principle that he had in this ideal bureaucratic structure for effectiveness was what he called span of control. So as you divide up the work, you have supervisors, and you make sure those supervisors have a limited number of people who they're responsible for. So rather than having the supervisor responsible for everyone in the organization, because that's just not realistic, you would have a supervisor who may be responsible for 3 subordinates, or maybe 5 subordinates, or maybe 7 subordinates. But you limit that supervisor's span of control so that they can better monitor what those subordinates are doing to, again, make the organization more efficient and more effective. He believed very much in the tall hierarchy, this pyramidal shape to our structure of our organization, one person at the top, and as you move down your organizational structure, you encounter more and more positions until you get to the bottom of your structure, and that's where the majority of your employees work. So it's a very pyramidal, tall, hierarchical shape to the structure of our organization. He thought that was the effective way to structure your organization. He believed that organizations should be rule-bound. We should write specific rules to govern our daily operations and then adhere strictly to those rules. The nice thing about having rules and adhering to those rules is that you treat people equally. So here is the rule, regardless of who comes into contact with our organization, this rule applies to everyone. And so you can protect those individual rights and, again, try and be as efficient and effective as possible. The people who work in your organization, your bureaucrats, are professionals and they are career administrators. They view their employment in this organization as a career. They're not going to bounce from one organization to the next. They're staying here for a career, and they are professionals. They are experts. They're experts in what they are doing on a daily basis. The tasks that they are working on a daily basis, they specialize in those tasks. So you'll have one person who's responsible for a small set of tasks, someone else responsible for a different set of tasks. Since you're doing those jobs every single day, day in and day out, you then become experts at it. You then become professional administrators at those jobs. And everything is based on written documentation. We document. We make sure we write down all these rules. We write down everything that we do on a daily basis. We document everything as scrupulously as we can. So Weber said this structure is what we know as an ideal bureaucracy. And if we can structure our organizations in this ideal bureaucratic structure, we can make our organizations efficient and effective. So when you are structuring your organization as an ideal bureaucracy, like Weber tells us to do, you are really emphasizing control. It's very much of a top-down control type of orientation. You're controlling the internal processes that are going on in your organization, and you're doing it through direct supervision. You're standardizing your behaviors and standardizing your routines, and then you're applying rules in very much of a legal type of way. That here are the rules, you need to abide by these rules. If you violate these rules, then obviously there will be punitive measures for the violation of those rules. So if we structure our organization like this, this is how we end up being effective as an organization. What types of limitations and drawbacks do you see with Weber's idea of an ideal bureaucracy?
Struggles with communication, I think, was one of the things our reading talked about, especially with the more layers you put in between different managers. You just create a lot of middle managers, essentially trying to have communication up and down.
Absolutely, yeah. The more you put in this organizational chart, you can really have a depressing effect upon communication. And yeah, you have all these middle managers, you have all these different levels, all these different units. Communication can kind of get lost along the way. People don't really feel that they're free to communicate vertically and horizontally through the organization. Absolutely. Humans, as mentioned in text, Jay, it was kind of overlooked the human element. Not just kind of, it really overlooked the human element. We were focusing on the structure. We didn't really think about the people who populated that organizational structure. We didn't really pay attention to the human relations type of aspect. Yeah, it didn't account for people's needs and people's wants and desires. It was all about what's in the best interest for the organization, not what's in the best interest of the individual members of that organization. And that was one of the primary criticisms of Weber's ideal bureaucracy, that then helped give rise to later schools of thought in terms of how we structure and manage our organizations. But Weber is one of those classical organization theorists. Frederick Taylor is another one in that classical school of organization theory. Frederick Taylor looked at the current situation as he saw it in the early 1900s. He saw a lot of labor unrest. He saw very little supervision and guidance being handed down from supervisors to employees. And he found our organizations to be rather chaotic. He found them to be relatively unstructured and very inefficient and very ineffective. So what is Taylor best known for? What theory is he best known for?
I was going to ask a question. Do these, sorry, I'm going a little bit off topic, but hopefully it's cool. Do these like thoughts or processes of how humans interact like fall under that thought process of like theory X, where basically like humans are unmotivated and just need to be like controlled and directed?
Right, exactly, yeah. And we'll get to Douglas McGregor in a few minutes, but that's exactly right. With the classical approach like a Max Weber or Frederick Taylor, it was very much a theory X type of approach, that people are unmotivated, that they're lazy, they're not creative, they're not going to put forth the effort to help make the organization effective. It was very much predicated upon that theory X approach to understanding human beings. And so they're just basically cogs in the machinery without a lot of inherent worth in and of themselves. Absolutely. And that's what Weber believed. That's also what Frederick Taylor believed as well. And yeah, as Natalie says, scientific management. And that's what Frederick Taylor is best known for, is his theory of scientific management. Where Taylor differs from Weber is Weber focused on the structure of the organization. And if we can structure the organization in this ideal approach, that's how we become efficient and effective as an organization. Taylor focused more on the process of work itself. And what Taylor wanted to do through his scientific management is he wanted to do what he called these time motion studies. And so he'll stand behind people with a stopwatch and he will time every single motion they take in doing their job. The idea is by doing that, you can get rid of all the inefficient motions. You can then put all the efficient, effective motions together into what he called the one best way to do the job. And that was his goal. He thought for every position in our organization, we could come up with that one best way to do the job. Then you hire people who have the skills to do that job in that one best way. You train them what the one best way is, and then you evaluate them. If they are doing the job in that one best way to do the job, they are being effective and they are being efficient, then you reward them. You give them money. You give them performance incentives. If once you watch them doing the job, if they're not doing the job the way in which they were taught, they're not doing it in that one best way, then you get rid of that employee. Again, they're replaceable cogs in the machinery. Just like with a machine, you can envision a machine with all these cogs that the teeth of one cog pushes against the tooth of another cog. Well, if a tooth breaks off of a cog, you take the cog out, you throw it away, you put a brand new one in, and you go about your business. Well, that's what people were. Taylor in some of his earlier writings referred to people as what he called boorish beasts. Whenever you refer to an employee as a boorish beast, obviously you're not really valuing that person as a human being. But that's a scientific management theory of Taylor. Beast of burden. And so you find the right person, you develop standards for the job, you find the right person, you systematize the process, you come up with that one best way to do the job, you then have the people do the job, you reward those who are doing the job well, and you get rid of people who are not doing the job in accordance with that one best way. Now, obviously, when you're talking about people as being, boorish beasts, you really don't value them as human beings. And that's one of the primary criticisms of scientific management, is it really overlooked the social aspect of organizations, really overlooked the wants, needs, and desires of those individual employees, and just really thought if we came up with the one best way to do a job, we can be efficient and effective as an organization. So what ties Weber and Taylor together, number one, they were focusing on the well-being of the organization as opposed to the employee. The second thing that ties Weber and Taylor together is their pursuit of the one best way. Weber was looking for the one best way to structure the organization. Taylor was looking for the one best way to do the jobs within the organization. Then obviously what separates Weber and Taylor, Weber was structural focused, Taylor was process focused, but they're both these authors that contributed to this classical school of organization theory. But again, the primary criticism of the classical school is it overlooked the value of human beings and didn't really take into account the human or the social aspect of having human beings working within organizations. A couple more authors that were kind of writing around the same time as the classical theorists, people like Henri Fayol. I don't know if you've been introduced to Fayol before in this program, but Henri Fayol talked a lot about what organizations do. And one of his criticisms of people like Taylor is that Taylor looked at management. You know, Taylor looked almost exclusively at how you manage how the job is being done. But Fayol argues to us that management is just one aspect of the overall governance of an organization. When you govern an organization, yes, you will engage in the management of employees, but you'll also engage in what he calls technical activities. Technical activities are basically the day-to-day creation of the goods and services and products that we are creating as an organization. So the actual, technologies that we are using to create what we are creating as an organization, those are our day-to-day technical activities, and that's all part of the governance of an organization. He says there are commercial activities as well that we have to be mindful of if we want to make for an effective organization. Commercial activities are these transactions that we are engaging in, either transactions with us and other agencies, transactions that are going on between us and the people who are consuming the goods and services and products that we are creating as an organization. Those are those commercial types of activities. Admittedly, you probably do a lot more commercial activities in the private sector than you do in the public sector, but all organizations engage in that type of transactional relationship with other entities. Financial activities. We have to generate revenue, and we have to spend that revenue in pursuance of the creation of our goods, services, and products. Security activities. We have to secure our organization, secure our employees, secure our products from challenges from other organizations. We don't want people coming in and stealing our technology or coming in and stealing our employees. And accounting activities, especially in the public sector. We have to account for how the money is being spent to make sure the money is being spent in the legally appropriate way in which it needs to be spent. And then, of course, obviously management. So management is just one of those activities that we are engaging in when we are governing our organizations. Fayol believed that there were 5 essential functions of managing an effective organization: planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. We have to plan our operations. We have to engage in strategic planning. We know that public and private managers both do that. We need to organize all the resources and the people in our organization and the tasks within our organization to make sure everything we are doing is contributing to the goal we're trying to achieve. If we have a lot of things going on that are not contributing to our goal, we're probably not going to be effective as an organization. Commanding. We need to tell people what to do and show subordinates how to do it. We need to coordinate everything that's going on within our organization as leaders to make sure, again, everything is working in harmony. And we need to control money, control personnel, control strategies. We need to be the controller within that organization. So he came up, based upon those essential functions of management, he came up with all these different principles that could lead to an effective organization. So to create an effective organization, he said we need things like division of labor, division of work. We need to do things like delegating authority to employees so that those employees can then develop their own sense of responsibility and accountability. We need to have disciplinary mechanisms in place if people aren't doing what they're supposed to do. We need to have unity of command so that everyone knows who they are responsible and who they are accountable to. We need to subordinate to the general interest. The private interest, personal interest will be subordinate to the interests of the organization and the interests of society as a whole. Proper remuneration. We have to pay people for the work they're doing and pay them adequately for their performance, and so on and so on. I won't go through them all. The last one there is an important one. It's esprit de corps. It's kind of this principle that we have to engender this culture where we all feel like we're in this together. And so what's in the best interest of the organization is also in our best interest as individual employees. The important, not to get too bogged down in the details, but the importance of FAIL and FAIL's contribution to our understanding of the impact of the internal environment on effectiveness is that we can boil down effectiveness into principles of management. We can then teach our managers how to do these principles on a daily basis. And if they do these principles, adhere to these principles, then our organizations can be effective. Very similar to someone by the name of Luther Gulick. You may have read about and heard about Luther Gulick before. Luther Gulick is also a believer in these principles. Now, he's part of what's called the Principle School of Management. Luther Gulick boiled down the principles into, as you probably heard before, the POSCORB School, which is the acronym that stands for Planning, Organizing, Staffing, Directing, Coordinating, Reporting, and Budgeting. This POSCORB School, all these different tools, these are essentially your generic management theories. Last time we talked about generic management theories versus theories that are applicable in the public sector. This idea of generic management theories is that all managers, whether they be private or public or nonprofit, are all going to engage in these POSCORB types of principles. You're all going to plan, you're all going to organize, you're all going to staff, so on and so on. These are tools that we could provide in basically a managerial toolkit to our managers. And if our managers had the right principles, the right tools, and knew when to use each tool in a given situation, that's how we have effective organizations. But again, it's similar to Weber and Taylor in that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. Here's the universe of tools that you need as a manager to be effective and make your organization effective. If you've got these tools and you know how to use them, that's how you become effective as a manager and as an organization. And that's kind of what ties Weber and Taylor and FAIL and Gulick together, is their search for this kind of one-size-fits-all approach to making our organizations effective. Weber said it was structure. Taylor said it was work process, the one best way to do the job. FAIL and Gulick says it's a set of principles that we need to teach to our managers. That's kind of this one-size-fits-all type of an approach. The problem, though, with, again, the classical school is that whether you're talking about Weber, Taylor, FAIL, Gulick, or any of the other kind of classical approaches to organization theory, we were kind of overlooking the human element. We didn't really spend a lot of time talking about the social element. Now, granted, FAIL had one of his principles, this esprit de corps, that kind of hinted at a social element, getting everyone to kind of believe they're in this together. We never really explicitly valued human beings and talked about how we can involve human beings in the life of the organization. They were almost kind of ancillary to the effectiveness of the organization. So as a result of those criticisms, we begin to see a new school emerge, and that's the human relations school. Now, the human relations school didn't just come out of thin air. That there's kind of a bridge between the classical school and the human relations school. And the bridge between the classical and the human relations school was this person by the name of Mary Parker Follett. And again, I assume you've probably been introduced to Mary Parker Follett before, but she is really useful for us tonight in our discussion of how the internal environment can impact the effectiveness of our organizations. Follett was writing at the heyday of scientific management. So when Follett was creating her theories and doing her writing, she was doing it when everyone else, for the most part, was accepting scientific management and implementing scientific management into their organizations. So Follett, one reason I really like Follett is because she was kind of this voice in the wilderness. She was the one person who was willing to stand up on a prominent scale and actually say, scientific management has these problems. Scientific management is completely ignoring individual employees. And so we really need to talk more about how can we govern our organizations in a more democratic way. So Follett likens governing an organization to governing a democracy. So let's think about running our organizations kind of like we think about running a democracy. She really believed in making our organization a democratic organization predicated upon participation of employees. The problem, though, is when you think about a democracy, according to Follett, she argued there are two fundamental flaws in a representative democracy. One flaw in a representative democracy is what she called particularized interest. And if you were a political science undergraduate and you've read the Federalist Papers before, you're probably familiar with Federalist Paper number 10, written by James Madison. And in Federalist number 10, James Madison warns us about these things he calls factions. Groups of people, groups in society who have vested interests that will come into conflict with other groups in society who have different vested interests. These particularized interests Follett's talking about basically the factions that Madison talked about way back in the late 1700s in Federalist number 10. So a democracy means by definition, we are going to have these particularized interests, and people having interests that run counter to other people's interests. That, according to Madison, is a natural outgrowth of democracy. And if you've read Federalist number 10, he says there are two ways to deal with these factions, these particularized interests. One is to eliminate them, but that's the bad way to do it, because if you eliminate your factions, you eliminate democracy. So the way in which you really handle it is you control their effects by balancing one faction against another. And you allow them to have this conflict and to come into conflict with each other, and they end up balancing each other out. In addition to these factions, these particularized interests, another thing you get from a representative democracy is you oftentimes get what she calls passive citizens. So citizens tend to participate in their own governance in a passive way. So the way in which most of us Americans participate in our own governance is primarily through going to the ballot box and voting. We've got a lot of other avenues we can participate, but many of us choose not to take advantage of those avenues. We could, if we want to attend meetings, we could, communicate directly with our representatives. We could run for office. We could, circulate petitions and participate in initiative processes here in California. A lot of things that we can do. Most of us are very passive, and we end up just voting, and that's how we participate. So Follett really want to focus on, if we're going to govern our organizations as democratic organizations with this participation on the part of our employees, we need to find a way in which we can try and rectify these two flaws of particularized interest and passive citizens. So the way she argues that we do it is whenever we have these particularized interests and they come into conflict with each other, she agrees with Madison that whenever you take a democratic perspective to running anything, whether it be a society or whether it be an organization, you are inherently going to have conflict between these different particularized interests. So how can you deal with those conflicts? Parker Follett says there are three ways you can do it. One way is domination. So one group wins, one group loses. So this group of employees wins, this group of employees loses. She says that's the worst way to deal with conflict between groups in an organization or a democracy. Because obviously the group that loses will be disaffected. And it's going to be hard to get their buy-in into making the organization effective. So we try to avoid domination. The other approach is compromise. So the two parties work together. One party gives up something, the other faction gives up something of their own. By both factions giving something up, they come to an agreement. That's compromise. She says compromise is better than domination, but it's still not ideal. For her in a democratic organization, the ideal way to deal with conflict in an effective organization is through what she calls integration and interpenetration of ideas. The idea here being that you have all the groups come together, they share their opinions, they share their perspectives, and throughout this sharing process, some of the opinions of one group will then, what she calls, interpenetrate into the thinking of another group. That, this group never really thought about it that way, but now that they've heard from this other group, okay, that may make some sense. And so you've got all these ideas that interpenetrate together, and that will then allow us to integrate into a new solution. Sometimes it's like osmosis, but we'll be able to integrate into a solution, a new solution that we just developed. That it's not we're giving up something, they're giving up something, but we work together to come up with this new approach to dealing with this problem or this issue. And because we all contributed to putting together this new approach, we then have buy-in in making sure this new approach is implemented effectively. You can kind of think about it from a democratic perspective is if you've ever read Theodore Lowy and his theory of the marketplace of ideas. Lowy argues that a democracy, if it's functioning appropriately, should be a marketplace of ideas. It's kind of like this virtual marketplace where, people go and they share ideas and they buy into some ideas and reject other ideas. But it's, this whole, interplaying, intermingling of different ideas in this marketplace. And that's kind of what she wanted to create in the organization. But doing that means, by definition, you have to have trust and participation. People must trust that they are able to participate and that their ideas will be heard, and you must provide avenues for that participation. So Mary Parker Follett talked a lot about being able to help people develop their own resources as individual employees so that they are empowered to participate in the discourse that's going on within this democratic organization. Now, one criticism of Mary Parker Follett is obviously that it is relatively idealistic. Now, you think about your organization, especially if you're operating in a very turbulent environment and you're responding to crises left and right, it may be difficult for you to engage in this true top to bottom, bottom to top type of democratic culture, if you will, that you're building within your organization. But she really felt democratic organizations were the most effective organizations, predicated upon trust and participation by all members of the organization. Yes, as Amber says, especially with politics involved, yeah. When we think about politics, and we define politics, we think about politics, as we may have mentioned before in a previous class, as the ability to use resources to influence someone to do something they may not otherwise do. Now that's kind of politics. And so you use your resources to convince someone or get someone, to take an action they may not otherwise take if you're not exercising those resources. And so whenever you got politics involved, it does sometimes become difficult to be this idealistic. And that's the major criticism of Follett, is that she was just a little too idealistic with the way in which she looked at organizations. But the big addition, if you will, the big contribution that Follett makes is with her theories on democratic organizations, she is now starting to value individual employees in terms of their ability to participate. And she thinks to be effective as an organization, you must provide these avenues to empower your employees and allow them to participate in the daily governance of the organization. The problem, again, for Mary Parker Follett, though, is when she was writing. She was writing in the 1920s, and she was espousing a lot of these theories of involving human beings and starting to consider human beings long before some other human relations theorists started doing their writing. And so Mary Parker Follett wrote a decade or 2 decades before people like Elton Mayo and some of the other human relations theorists. So I oftentimes like to look at Mary Parker Follett as a pre-human relations theorist. She's kind of this bridge that takes us from the classical school, looking at the organization and discounting individual employees, to the human relations school, where we actually start looking at employees and the social aspects of organizations. And we realize that organizations can never be fully effective unless they consider the informal social aspects of how human beings interact with each other within the organizational environment. So Elton Mayo is one of these human relations theorists. And I'm sure you've probably heard of and worked with Elton Mayo before. Elton Mayo was concerned about the social disorganization that he saw in organizations at the time in which he was writing. He thought that, especially in factory-oriented types of organizations, there was a lot of irrationality and a lot of disorganization. We won't really go into some of the psychological reasons why, a little bit beyond the scope and the time that we have tonight. But Mayo is probably most well known for his illumination studies. And he went into the Hawthorne electrical plant and decided to do some studies in the Hawthorne electrical plant. Can you tell me about, anybody remember Mayo and the Hawthorne studies and what that was all about and what he concluded? Mayo and the Hawthorne studies?
Was that where they played with the amount of light the workers had while conducting their tasks? And if I remember correctly, the conclusion was that it wasn't the light necessarily itself, so not the physical condition, but sort of the intrinsic motivation of the workers that drove productivity.
Perfect. I couldn't say it better myself. That's exactly it. So, hypothesis is that the lighting level will have an impact upon productivity. So you go in there and you turn the lights up, and yes, indeed, people become more productive. So, okay, that hypothesis is confirmed. Let's turn the lights down. We expect productivity to go down. If you turn down the lights, productivity still went up. It was the recognition that by talking to people, by interacting with people as part of this experiment, people felt valued. And they felt that they were being valued as individuals. They were getting, as Natalie says, they're giving attention. And by giving them this attention, it motivated them to be more productive. So it really recognizes the human element of productivity and effectiveness within organizations, kind of that informal type of aspect to your organizational structure. But the classical school was all formality. Here now with Mayo and the human relations theorist, it becomes a little bit more informal. How do human beings interact with each other, and how does that interaction psychologically then motivate them to be more productive and therefore make the organization more effective? They put people in groups, and then they measured the productivity of those groups. And they found that in those groups, if there was a member of a group that was not performing up to the level they should be performing, they were just doing what Taylor would call soldiering. They were just kind of, just barely getting the job done. Other members of that group didn't want to look bad, so they would put pressure on that person to make that person then motivate them to be more productive and higher performance level. So it's kind of this, recognition of these informal groups and how people react from a psychological perspective and how their reactions can then make the organization more effective. So finally, we are starting to recognize the organization as a social system. It's not just the formal structure of the organization, but now it's those informal relationships that become important in trying to enhance the effectiveness of an organization. And you see, we move quite far from where we were with the classical school with people like Weber and Taylor. And there are a lot of other human relations theorists that if this was an organization theory class, obviously we'd go through them, but I don't think it's necessary for our time constraints tonight. But overall, in general, the human relations school with people like Mayo and Roethlisberger and others, they added this human element to our understanding of creating effective organizations. But the limitation and the criticism a lot of people have for the human relations school is that they were considering human beings for a reason. And that reason wasn't to help develop those human beings. The reason was to make the organization more effective. So at the end of the day, the goal of human relations theories are similar to the goals of classical theories. It's the organization. And it's how can we make the organization more effective without a lot of concern for developing individual employees as human resources. And it's that criticism of the human relations school that then gave rise to the school of human resource management theory. And this is where we start getting into people like Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, who we mentioned earlier, Chris Ardress, and those types of theorists. The Human Resource Management School considers human beings, again, they're considering human beings like the Human Relations School is considering human beings, but for a different purpose. For human relations theorists, the purpose was pay attention to people, listen to people, so that they will contribute to the effectiveness of the organization. Human resource management theorists say talk to people, listen to people, care about their wants, needs, and desires so that we can help them grow as individuals. We can help them grow as human beings and develop themselves as human resources. Even if when they develop their resources and their abilities, even if they decide to leave the organization and take those skills with them, that's still a good thing in human resource management theory because we've developed them as human beings. They're going to leave the organization. If they do, but they're going to contribute to society as a whole with these augmented skills that they have developed through our help as an organization. So it's about more than just the organization itself. If you want to take a turn of phrase from John F. Kennedy and say, it's no longer asking what can the individual do for the organization, it's also now what can the organization do for the individual employee. So Abraham Maslow, we talk about here in human resource management theory, just because he had such a big influence on later human resource management theorists like Douglas McGregor and Chris Ardress. You're probably all familiar with the hierarchy of needs of Abraham Maslow. You've probably seen it ad nauseum at the undergraduate level, probably also seen it in this program. So if you're familiar with this hierarchy of needs, there are different levels of needs that human beings have. Physiological needs at the bottom, things like food and water and warmth, safety needs, security and safety, belongingness and love needs, to have relationships with people and to have friends. Esteem needs, the feeling of prestige and the feeling of accomplishment, and that people respect you. And at the apex of this pyramid, you have self-actualization, which is your ability to achieve your full potential, to kind of be all that you can be. Maslow tells us that people are motivated to try and achieve these different levels of needs. At the physiological need level and the safety need level and the belongingness need level, those are all what we consider to be deficiency needs. So people are motivated by a deficiency in those needs. So if you don't have enough food or water, you're motivated to get food and water. Once those needs have been satisfied, it then ceases to be a motivator for you. Once you've satisfied the deficiency, then that will no longer motivate you. The top need, self-actualization, he called the growth need, in that that's going to continue. You're never going to be able to fully fulfill that need, and you're always going to be striving to achieve your full potential and to be all that you can be. Well, so what? What does that mean for human resource management theory? It means that we as managers need to understand the needs and the wants and desires of individual employees and then try to help them achieve those wants, needs, and desires. Obviously, it will motivate them, but it will also help them develop as human beings so that they can hopefully move toward that self-actualization and truly becoming all that they can be. Douglas McGregor, who we talked about earlier, was a student of Abraham Maslow. He believed in Abraham Maslow, and Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs really did affect a lot of the theories developed by Douglas McGregor. And as we talked about earlier, Douglas McGregor is best known for what's called his human side of the enterprise and his development of Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X, as we said, viewed employees as being very lazy, as being uncreative, as being not very intelligent, not very innovative, a very dim view of individual human beings, kind of similar to a classical view like Weber and Taylor had. Contrast that to Theory Y. Theory Y is just the opposite of Theory X, as you know. It means that people are creative, that they're ambitious, that putting forth the effort to work is as natural as putting forth effort to play and recreate. Douglas McGregor argued that most of our employees are theory Y employees. They're creative, they're innovative, and they're motivated. Now, he didn't say everyone is theory Y. You know, he realizes you can have a few clunkers in organizations who aren't theory Y, but for the most part, most employees are theory Y. The problem for McGregor is that most organizations are theory X. Most organizations are still built on Weber's ideal bureaucracy. They're still predicated on work processes such as developed in Taylor and scientific management. They're still based upon those principles from the principal school. So we're basically shoehorning theory Y employees into theory X organizations. So McGregor argued that organizations, in order to be effective, and again, let's not lose focus for our ultimate goal here, it's to make the organization effective. In order to be effective, organizations needed to transition from theory X to theory Y organizations. They needed to try and start providing abilities and opportunities for employees to self-actualize, to develop the skills that they want to develop. So you actually talk to your employees and you ask your employees, where do you want to be in 10 years? Where do you see yourself? What types of skills do you think you need to develop to get where you want to be? And then you enrich their jobs, something called job enrichment. You enrich their jobs so that they have the ability to develop those skills and to learn those concepts that will then allow them to be where they want to be and self-actualize in the future. So it's incumbent upon the organization, in order to be effective, to transition itself from a theory X orientation to a theory Y orientation. A student of Douglas McGregor that basically took McGregor's theories and ran with them is Chris Argyris. Chris Argyris describes for us that as people mature, they go through this maturation process that is predicated upon personal growth. As people mature and as they go through this personal growth process, they engage in increased activism. They become more active in their own self-determination. They become more independent as human beings. They become more multifaceted in the ways in which they are able to behave, and they behave in multiple different ways. They develop deepening interests. They develop a longer time perspective. So it's not just what will benefit me today and tomorrow, but they look down the road and where they want to be in several years. They aspire to superordinate positions. They want to move up in the organization. They want to acquire more responsibility and move into these supervisory types of positions. They develop more of a self-awareness. They understand themselves better and they're more comfortable in themselves. Again, classic organization theory, theory X organizations run counter to this personal growth orientation of individuals. So as people are trying to go through this personal growth process, theory X organizations hold them down and make it more difficult for them to grow. So Argyris agrees with McGregor, our organizations to be effective must become theory Y organizations to allow these theory Y employees to go through their personal growth process and to actually help them as they move through this personal growth process. Now, again, the big difference between human resource management theory and human relations theory is that human resource management theory really valued the growth and development of individual employees as an end all of itself, as a goal in and of itself. That even if the people leave the organization, we have helped them develop and that it's a good thing. Human relations theory still looked at the organization and said that we're going to pay attention to people because that will make them more motivated to help us achieve our organizational goals. And so that's the big difference between human relations and human resource management theory. Again, I know we're kind of running a little long in the tooth here, so I'm assuming these are theories that you've probably been introduced to before, but what we're doing tonight is kind of taking them, putting them in the context of how can we internally within our organizations, what types of things can we do to make our organizations more effective? So another group of theories that I'm sure you've heard about before and learned about before is systems theory. Systems theory, for our purposes tonight, we're going to look primarily at natural systems theory or closed systems theory and open systems theory. Systems theory looks at organizations as kind of part of a whole, that organizations are a part of the entire system. And so they're only one part of that system. But what goes on in the organization can have an impact upon the rest of that system. The idea is that with natural or closed systems theory, we kind of liken those organizations to living organisms. So we're kind of getting back to that ecology of public administration type of perspective. So we think about organizations as being living organisms. Those living organisms obviously operate within an ecology, within an environment. And the primary focus of natural systems theory is to look at the environment within the organization and how we can modify that environment within the organization to achieve organizational health and organizational harmony. So in natural systems theory, we're going to be looking at internal processes within the organization, relationships between different employees and different units within the organization, relationship between leadership and middle management and line workers in the organization, relationship between line and staff employees. We're looking primarily at the inner workings within the organization. Open systems theory goes beyond the walls of the organization and really starts to look at how the organization interacts with its external environment. And that's what kind of makes that open systems as opposed to natural or closed systems theory. What unifies both natural and open systems theory is the assumption that, again, organizations are part of a system, and those systems do not have a concrete existence. Those systems are dynamic and changing in nature. And we have to look at the interdependence of all the parts in that system, recognizing that the interdependence and those relationships between all those parts can really change and be very dynamic over time. Both in natural or closed systems theory and open systems theory, one of the goals of the organization is to achieve a point of equilibrium or a balance point. For natural systems theory, that balance point is this thing known as homeostasis. It's basically when all the parts within the organization are in harmony and in balance with each other. So when you think about the human body finds its point of equilibrium, its point of homeostasis, when blood pressure is normal, when oxygen saturation rates are normal, when the body is devoid of any types of diseases or maladies, then you've got this health, you've got this equilibrium, this point of homeostasis within the human body. That's the type of thing you're looking for in natural systems theory within the organization. For open systems theorists, their equilibrium point, their point of homeostasis, is when the organization is in balance with the external environment. And that's their point of homeostasis. Now, really quickly, let's look at one author in natural systems theory. We'll look at one author that kind of bridges the gap between natural system and open systems theory, and then we'll look at authors in the open systems theory category. We'll do this relatively quickly because I know we're past 7:30. In natural systems theory, one person we usually look at is Chester Barnard. Chester Barnard, and again, Barnard is a very famous theorist across a lot of different aspects of public administration. But Barnard views organizations as being a cooperative system. It's a cooperative system where managers, leaders cooperate with their employees. And the goal is to provide incentives to employees that will then induce those employees to provide contributions to the goals of the organization. So your goal in Barnard's approach is for organizational leaders to find the right set of incentives to provide to employees that will induce those employees to then give the contributions that the organization needs to achieve its goals. And then the organization becomes effective. So it's this balance of rewards and incentives provided to employees and contributions that employees then provide back to the organization. So in order to get this report done, you're going to need employees to come in on a Saturday to finish up that job. Well, coming out on the Saturday, that's a contribution those employees are giving to you and to the organization. So how can you incentivize them to do that without causing a lot of dissatisfaction? If you just tell them you're coming in on Saturday, they're not going to like that, and that's going to lead to a lot of job dissatisfaction on their part. So what can you provide for them? Can you make them employee of the week, or can you provide them with maybe a more attractive office location, or what can you provide for them within your limitations in the public sector in order to incentivize them giving you that contribution so that they are not then dissatisfied by having to come in on a Saturday. For Barnard, efficiency was defined as when the contributions you get from your employees exceed the net dissatisfaction among those employees of doing what you ask them to do. Because when they give these contributions, if they get nothing in return, that's going to enhance their dissatisfaction. So you're efficient if you're getting the contributions you need while still limiting their dissatisfaction. In the private sector, compensation is the primary vehicle you can use as an incentive to induce people to provide those types of contributions. Absolutely. Effectiveness for Barnard is when the organization achieves its goals. But the organization cannot achieve its goals unless it gets the right contributions from its employees. The additional problem that you have, according to Barnard, is every employee is different. So every employee is going to have a different set of incentives that they're going to respond to. And in a couple of weeks, when we talk about motivation, we'll talk about Vroom, and we'll talk about sets of incentives and how to know what incentives to use. But for some employees, one incentive may make a difference. For another employee, that same incentive may not matter. Basically, employees put different valence levels on different incentives, different value levels on those incentives. So you have to treat individual employees differently. And every individual employee, according to Barnard, has their own zone of indifference. So if you ask someone to do something that does not violate their values or their ethics or inconvenience them too much, they're probably going to acquiesce and do it. How they're in their zone of indifference. They're kind of indifferent to it. Yeah, I'll do it because it's not really that much of an imposition to me. If, however, you ask someone to do something that violates their values and their principles, you have now moved outside of their zone of indifference. Now you're going to get pushback. And by asking them to do this, they may flat out refuse to do it. Or if they even do it, that's going to lead to higher levels of employee dissatisfaction. So you have to know each individual employee, know what they value, what they incentivize, and then know their individual zones of indifference in order to properly manage those employees. Because for Barnard, effectiveness in achieving the goals of the organization is predicated upon this cooperation between leaders and employees. Leaders knowing how to get the right contributions out of their employees in order to make the organization effective. One of the criticisms of Barnard, obviously, is that it still is predicated in the classical view because you're still trying to achieve the goal of the organization. You're kind of using the employee to help the goals of the organization. Barnard's still not terribly concerned about the wants, needs, and desires of the individual employee beyond just knowing what they want in order to get what you need out of them. So there's very little justification that Barnard provided for that type of social control of employees within organizations. But for Barnard, it was, again, getting these contributions in order to achieve the goals of the organization. That's what he considered to be effectiveness within the organization. Robert Merton is another author that kind of bridges the gap between natural and open systems theory. Merton is best known for what's called his middle range theories. And Merton questioned this whole natural systems idea of an organization as a living organism. He argued that an organization can't really be likened to a living organism because living organisms are oriented around survival. So you would think just about everything an organism does will help further its survival and the prospect of its survival. Not everything an organization does ensures its survival. Not everything an organization does is even important for its goal or survival. Not every activity an organization does is indispensable for survival. So he said, really, we can't look at them as living organisms. So he really shifts the focus away from that orientation and shifts the focus to consequences. For Merton, organizational effectiveness was measured as the consequences of the actions of the organization on its constituents. So let's take a look at how what the organization is doing is benefiting the constituents, the beneficiaries of the policies and the programs. He felt that effectiveness really would be measured as, are we providing what our constituents and beneficiaries need? It's kind of similar to the Clinton-Gore administration, the reinvention of government, and the idea of looking at what our constituents need and seeing, are we providing consequences that are beneficial to those constituents? The problem, Merton argues, is that a lot of organizations lose sight of the consequences that are being provided for their beneficiaries, which he says is a true measure of effectiveness. Instead, what a lot of organizations end up doing is they end up engaging in what he calls these bureaucratic dysfunctions. One type of bureaucratic dysfunction that he looks at is what he calls overconformity. Overconformity to rules. As organizations age and become more fragmented and become larger, organizations tend to develop more rules and procedures, a la Max Weber and classic organization theory. As they start developing all these rules and regulations, the goal of the organization suddenly becomes adherence to the rules and regulations as opposed to providing the necessary benefits to beneficiaries. That's what he calls goal displacement. So the goal then becomes adherence to rules as opposed to providing the right set of benefits to our beneficiaries and to our constituents. The more rules and regulations we develop as an organization, the more institutional rigid we become. And we become institutionally rigid organizations, we then have put walls between ourselves and our beneficiaries. So it's hard for us to even interact with and know whether or not our beneficiaries are getting the types of benefits and consequences that they should be getting from our organizations. So the important part of Merton is he looks beyond the internal workings of the organization, like the natural systems theorist did, and he starts looking at the consequences for people outside the organization, consequences for our external beneficiaries. Which again kind of then serves as a nice bridge to get us into open systems theory. Open systems theory then looks at the entire external environment. Beneficiaries, people and organizations we're competing with, revenue that we can get access to, staffing levels we can get access to, all those characteristics that we talked about at the beginning of tonight. That's then what open systems theory starts looking at. Really takes that external focus on the external environment. Now, again, the goal of the organization is to find that point of balance, that equilibrium between the organization and its external environment. Open systems theorists argue that organizations need to actively adapt to changes in their environment. So as the environment changes, organizations need to change in concert with those changes in the environment. The problem, though, is that in systems theory in general, as organizations age, they not only develop more rules and regulations, but as organizations age, they start to dissipate energy. They start to lose energy. It's kind of like if you think about it as a living organism, like the natural systems theorists do. As a living organism gets older, it becomes a process of decaying. It starts, getting older. It gets less healthy. It starts losing energy. It starts losing resources. That's this process known as entropy. So entropy, when an organization engages in entropy, it starts dissipating its energy out into the environment until it's dissipated so much energy that eventually it can no longer sustain itself and it goes out of existence. For natural systems theorists, that's the natural course for an organization. It'll just entropy, it'll give out its energy, and then it'll go out of existence. Open systems theorists counter that with this thing they call negative entropy. Negative entropy means that as you are dissipating energy out into the environment, you are also actively importing new energy back into your organization. So replace that loss of energy with new energies. So you bring in new sources of revenue. You bring in new employees who have different perspectives and different ways of thinking. You develop more support from different aspects of your external environment. And that's all what they call this negative entropy, pulling in, obtaining all of those energies from your external environment. And then the 25-cent word of the night that we get from open systems theorists is this term known as equifinality. Equifinality says that there are multiple different ways for organizations to achieve this equilibrium with their environment. Some organizations will achieve this equilibrium by, again, bringing in new employees and bringing in new staff into the organization. Some will achieve this equilibrium through developing a system of political support, whereby they've developed trust between the organization and the elected officials who create, empower, and fund the organization. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So I wonder, because of the very nature of the systems theory, right, where everything is presumed to be forever changing, that equilibrium is fleeting at best. So do they address, is it like a constant strive to regain and reestablish the equilibrium? Because even when you get it, it only lasts a moment, right? Whatever that moment happens to be.
Right. That's an excellent point. You're exactly right, that it is fleeting, it's dynamic. And so you achieve that steady state, you achieve that point of equilibrium, it's not permanent. That point of equilibrium can change depending upon changes in your environment, changes you cannot control in your organization. And so you're always searching to find that new point of equilibrium. And so, yeah, you're right. It's a very dynamic situation. That's why open systems theorists argue that organizations need to be very adaptive to their environment. It's not the type of thing that once you get that equilibrium, you always have it. You're always adapting to those changes in your environment. And organizations that are not able to adapt to those changes are the organizations that then will end up dissipating so much energy that they may actually go out of existence. The idea of searching for that point of equilibrium and importing new energies into the organization is a model of effectiveness we'll talk about in a couple of weeks called the systems resource model of effectiveness. Systems resource model of effectiveness defines effectiveness as the ability of the organization to import new energy and import new resources from its external environment. And so some organizations will consider themselves to be effective if the amount of revenue they're generating from their from the legislative body has gone up by 5%. Well, we're effective because we're bringing more of those resources in. Or, we were effective this year because we brought this new leadership team in from our external environment. That would be a systems resource type of model of effectiveness. In a couple of weeks, we'll go through all these different models of effectiveness. That's just, one of those models in addition to the goal attainment model that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. But I think, systems theory is a fascinating theory because, especially open systems theory, it says that there are a lot of moving parts. And those moving parts, it's a moving target, if you will, to find that equilibrium with our environment. And our success and our effectiveness as an organization is oftentimes predicated upon our environment. The capacity of the environment to sustain us, changes in the environment, all have an impact upon our effectiveness as an organization. Because again, at the end of the day, or at the end of the night tonight, our ultimate goal, obviously, is, again, effectiveness and talking about how environments can have an impact upon our effectiveness as an organization. I know we're approaching 8 o'clock, so just quickly, let me just throw a couple more at you and then we'll take a break. The Structural Contingency School is a school that I think does a good job of reminding us of the contextual nature of effectiveness in the public sector. Structural contingency model tells us there's no one best way of structuring our organizations. So it just flat out says classical theory and Weber, they're wrong. There's no one best way of structuring the organization. The most effective way of structuring our organization will depend upon factors that can vary between organizations. So as we said before, environmental uncertainty. We have to look at our environment, assess our environment, how stable, how dynamic our environment is. Technical aspects of our organization also can affect how we structure and operate our organizations. Some organizations use a lot of technologies in doing their job and carrying out their functions. Others do not. Others are much more straightforward and don't have those types of technologies that they have to deal with. The size of the organization obviously will have an impact upon the most effective way to structure that organization. If you're a small organization, communication may be much easier, both horizontal and vertically, as opposed to being a very large organization. Strategy, what are the strategies of your organization? That will have an impact upon the structure of your organization as well. Resource dependence, are you relatively independent in terms of your resources, or are you very dependent upon your environment? Are those resources, are they dependent upon the state of the economy? If you are dealing with grants, well, grants are not guaranteed from one year to the next. So in poor fiscal times, those grants may end up going away. You may have a huge hole that's blown in your budget. If you're relying upon appropriations, you may have much more stability in that regard. Public accountability and transparency. So how accountable are you to the public? How much public scrutiny is there for your organization? What types of proactive steps do you have to take in order to be as transparent as possible? If you have a lot of different meetings and a lot of different aspects of your organization, a lot of different units within your organization, maintaining that transparency with the public may end up becoming a little bit more difficult. But I like the structural contingency approach because it says the way we structure our organizations for effectiveness will depend upon the characteristics of that organization and its environment. Again, obviously, I like it a lot because it really feeds into my favorite answer, which is it depends. It really does depend upon the context of the situation in which we are dealing with. Really, the structural contingency approach really introduces for us the end of this one best way to structure the organization that Weber tried to sell us back in the classical school of organization theory. And then the final school that I'll talk about tonight is organizational culture. And you've probably talked about organization culture before here in this program. I like the organizational culture school of thought, especially when we're talking about organizational effectiveness. Organizational culture school argues that every organization has its own unique culture. And when we talk about culture, I think we all kind of have a sense of what culture is, but somebody give me a definition of culture. What do we mean by a culture?
So typically a collection of ideals, morals, just maybe even the way people dress, the way they expression is a lot of that. And usually there's rules of what you do and what you don't do. Some of them spoken, some of them not so spoken.
Exactly, absolutely. It's a set of values. It's a set of expectations for how we will behave and how we will interact with each other. Sometimes norms, values. Sometimes those norms and those values and those expectations are spoken. They're very transparent. They're very out there in the open. Sometimes they're unspoken. They're kind of assumed, and we don't really talk about them, but we all kind of know that they're there. And as a society, we kind of accept those cultural mores and those cultural norms. Every organization has its own unique culture. And there are three different ways that we can study culture, three different aspects of culture that we can study. We can study organizations kind of like an archaeologist would study an ancient society. So an archaeologist to study an ancient society, you're going to go on an archaeological dig. And you're going to dig up, maybe bowls and eating utensils and things like that. Those bowls and eating utensils, they're artifacts that you're going to dig up. Those artifacts are visible examples of the culture of that ancient society. They're visible examples of how daily life occurred. Visible examples of what that ancient society valued and how that ancient society behaved and interacted with each other. Just like archaeologists can dig up artifacts, we can dig up artifacts from our organizations as well. So an artifact of an organization that gives us some insight into culture can be things like meeting minutes, meeting agendas, organizational charts. Those are very visible. They're produced on a daily basis by organizations. They're very easy to acquire. So when you study organizational culture and you dig up these artifacts, they're kind of at the surface, and they're very easy to see, and they're very easy to acquire. The second level of culture is what's called the espoused values. Espoused values are oftentimes the goals of the organization that the organization speaks. So these are, this is us as an organization. Here's our mission statement. Here are the goals that we are trying to achieve as an organization. Again, not that hard to acquire, but they're kind of at a deeper level than just those artifacts, those agendas, and those meeting minutes. The third level that we can study in culture is the most difficult one to study, and those are basic assumptions. These are usually unspoken assumptions about what we value and about how we treat each other and how we interact with each other. So you're not going to find these written down anywhere. They're not going to be like a mission statement or a strategic plan. These are basic assumptions that we all share as members of that organization. Organization culture is oftentimes embedded by leadership. So a new leader will come into the organization and they will want to embed their culture into the organization. It's a very common thing that new leaders want to do. There are different ways that they can embed culture into an organization. There are primary and secondary and tertiary strategies. Now, sometimes a leader will come into the organization and they'll bring with them a slogan. So, here's the slogan that we are all going to put on the bottom of our emails and we're going to put on all our stationery. This is the slogan that we are going to use as an organization. That's one way to embed culture. Another way to embed culture is by creating a pattern of how you deal with employees. So what you reward will tell your employees, this is what this leader values. This is what our culture values. And so if you do this, this is something in line with our basic assumptions. And so therefore there are rewards for behaving in this type of way. Just another way in which you can embed that culture. I always thought of culture as behavior, rituals, routines, inclusive interactions, language, communications. Absolutely, yeah. That's all the culture of the organization and the way in which we express and communicate that culture, not only to members of the organization, but also members of our environment as well. Well, it depends is my favorite answer, and so what is my favorite question? So what? Why are we talking about organization culture here? We're talking about organization culture because organization culture will have a major impact upon how we define and measure effectiveness in our organization. So depending upon the norms and values that are part of our culture, different organizations may have different norms and values, which will lead them to different operational definitions of what those organizations consider to be effective and what's considered to be ineffective. So the culture of the organization can have a big impact upon the definition and measurement of organizational effectiveness. But again, all we've been trying to do tonight through this entire 2-hour discussion is to highlight for you some of the influences that the external environment can have upon the effectiveness of an organization, as well as looking within the organization at some of the internal dynamics within the organization and how those internal dynamics in that internal environment can also then have an impact upon how we define and measure organizational effectiveness. Essentially, through this entire discussion, going from the classical school all the way up to organization culture school, and again, we haven't covered all the schools in organization theory, obviously, but we kind of hit the highlights that really contribute to our discussion of effectiveness. Some of the trends that we have seen is that one of the trends is to move more toward a recognition of the external environment. In Weber and Taylor, we really didn't talk a lot about the external environment. Today, we look at that external environment with open systems theory, with Merton, his middle range theories, with organization culture, with structural contingency model. We really do value that external environment in helping us understand how we measure and define effectiveness in an organization. A second major trend is the contextual aspect of it all. We recognize the contextual nature of organizational effectiveness. And what is defined as effectiveness in one setting may not be defined as effectiveness in another setting. what's considered effective in one organization at one point in time may be different than another organization at a different point in time. We've also recognized the multiplicity of determinants of effectiveness. Effectiveness can be determined by a lot of these different aspects of the external environment, like capacity and homogeneity of opinions and consensus dissensus. Can also be determined by a lot of these different aspects within our organization inside that organizational culture. But most of all, what we have found is there's no longer a one best way. There's no one best way to achieve effectiveness, no one best way to measure effectiveness. It's a much more situational, much more contextual endeavor today than it ever has been in the past. So what do we need to do at this point? Well, given the fact that we've gone through the external and the internal environment and their impacts upon effectiveness, we're going to take a break. But after we come back from the break, we will do our breakout groups. And what I want each group to do once we come back, and I'll assign the groups when we come back, but once we come back in our breakout groups, I want each group to think about their organizations and identify some of the aspects of the external environment that impact effectiveness and some of the aspects of the internal environment within the organization that also impact effectiveness. And so what I want each group to do is come up with two commonalities, two common aspects of the external environment that you see across your organizations, and two aspects of the internal environment that you see across your organizations as well. So it's 8 o'clock. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So we take a 10-minute break. Come on back at 8:10. I'll put you in the breakout groups, and we'll go ahead and do our exercise. Okay? So take a break. Come on back at 8:10, and we'll pick up from there. Okay, welcome back. We are back from break. So let me go ahead, and I've created 4 different breakout groups. I think that usually works out pretty well. So I'll go ahead and open up the rooms, and we'll spend, let's say, about 20 minutes. So I'll give it about 8:30. Again, what you are doing is you're identifying a couple aspects of the external environment and a couple aspects of the internal environment from your organizations that you think affect organizational effectiveness. Again, I'm looking for you to find commonalities if you can across your organizations. So we'll do this for 20 minutes, reconvene at 8:30, and then we will share out. So let me go ahead and open the rooms, and we can have at it. Okay, I think that we are all back in the main room now. So let's just spend a few minutes seeing what everyone came up with and see what types of commonalities we have between our groups. So let's start out with room number 1.
That would be us. So let's see. So for the external commonalities, we had, well, political actually aspect was kind of in both internal and external, primarily because you have that internal kind of hierarchy of approval within the public sector that kind of inhibits effectiveness depending on the any political relationships between supervisors or internal perspectives on politics. And then in terms of external, I found that we had interest groups that affect the politics behind the management. And then there's also political, at least in my organization and a lot of the government, are the elected officials and the potential for instilling their own political agendas. Also reliability of funding externally, especially with COVID-19. There's a lot of fluctuation in funding that can affect efficiency. Working from home has had its pros and cons. Externally, a lot from what we got in our group, a lot of people who were told they had to come back in the office would quit. So that's a turnover issue that a lot of us are experiencing. Let's see. I think it's just overall customer relations as well, was what that came up as an external impact. And I think that's it, unless anyone else from my group would like to correct me. Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Amber. Well done. And yeah, I'll just pick up on a couple of those. And the one I'll pick up on, one of the few things I'll pick up on is the funding that you mentioned, with the COVID relief types of measures. And I think, that is a great area for a lot of organizations, not knowing, especially I know in the education world, not knowing if those COVID funds are going to continue and how long those COVID funds will continue. The problem is when you get those COVID funds, and there are some strings attached, but oftentimes there's a little bit of flexibility involved, at least in the world of K through 12 education. If you then redirect some funds, you may not get those COVID funds in the future. And so there's a lot of uncertainty there. I think in terms of the remote work, that's a really interesting one. And I've seen that at Long Beach. Is that a lot of our staff, I think I mentioned before, they went into remote work types of arrangements with the understanding that once campus operations would open up again, that there would be a discussion about continuing to work remotely, at least for a portion of their work assignment. The problem with that, though, is there is a delay between when that promise is made and when it can actually happen, because you have to have meet and confers with your bargaining units, because it's a change in work conditions. And there's a lot of negotiation that goes on in terms of what percentage of work can be done remotely and how that work gets evaluated. And so in the interim, a lot of those employees have been told they have to come back onto campus, even though they had the expectations they would be able to continue at least a percentage of the work online. So yeah, it's difficult because you've got those types of meet and confer requirements before, if you are going to make it permanent to work remotely, before that can actually take effect. So very good. Thank you. Let's go with group number 2.
I don't know who's speaking for a group, but I guess I'll go. We talked about, as an internal influence on organizational effectiveness culture, and just how it can have both a positive and a negative influence on effectiveness. I think Alicia shared that their team focused on doing Strengths Finder and Strengths Quest and kind of opening up more of the communication, how that helped a little bit with effectiveness versus some other people who didn't have as strong of a team culture, and that maybe impacted how effectively the team could work together. And then we also talked in terms of external, similar to group 1, just the political influences that some of our organizations face, and how that can change the direction of what we're actually focusing on addressing versus maybe what we actually think needs to be addressed, just based on politics and how it sways what attention or what issue gets attention.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And that's, yeah, I think that we sometimes we sometimes underemphasize a bit in the classroom the political nature. And I think, Norton Wong is one of those authors who tells us that by definition, administrators do have a political role to play. Charles Goodsell's another one in his Case for the Bureaucracy, where he told us that public administrators need to be more proactive in terms of showing the public how vitally important a lot of the things that public agencies do are to their everyday lives. A lot of people don't think about just how their everyday life is affected by government programs and the actions of public agencies. And so Goodsell argues that administrators need to be a little bit more public and a bit more political in terms of the way that they make that case to citizens. So very well done. Good. Also, I saw the comment in text chat about how some organizations ignore the issue of remote work and pretend that that's not an issue. And I think some organizations really are struggling with that right now because they don't really know how to address it moving forward. So good. Okay, room number 3.
Good evening, all. We also focused on the politics, legislation, election year, regulations. Then in our internal, we looked at nepotism, poor leadership, and low morale. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. The morale issue is one that we're going to pick up on later on in the course. And when we start talking about motivation and employee engagement, we'll take a look at that federal study that the Merit System Protection Board and Office of Personnel Management that they do on an annual basis, looking at the morale level and the engagement level of federal employees and how that thing compares across agencies and also compares with the private sector. And there, at least for some agencies, there has been a incline, if you will, in terms of engagement and morale. For other agencies, it's been just the opposite story. And I think what we usually see in that study is we see larger organizations tend to have lower levels of federal employee engagement. The smaller organizations are the ones that tend to have the highest levels of engagement, the highest levels of employee satisfaction. But again, that just underscores that structural contingency type of approach, that the size of the organization certainly has an impact on a lot of indicators of effectiveness. Good, thank you, Tanya. And finally, our room number 4. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, this is Carol. So within our group, we stated there were 2. The first one would be leadership styles. So we talked about how both internally and externally, this can have an impact on effectiveness. So we talked about how there can be different leadership styles of either a micromanager or someone that's disconnected, which affects the culture and the tone of the relationship between the manager and the subordinates. We also said that in terms of leadership styles, communication plays a big role as it can interrupt the flow of effectiveness. And we described that this can, have a lag of time of the process, as sometimes you need to get signatures, within the hierarchy system. So you either have to go up or down the hierarchy system in terms of getting something processed because of just the way it's set up. So that obviously has an impact on the effectiveness. And then we also said politics, as this plays a huge role in funding, as there's, different shareholders, such as elected officials, the mayor, city council, board, which leads to the resources and where the funding comes from, which can have an impact on the efficiency of, delivering these different services within your organization. We also talked about how this can have an impact because, when you have different resources, like terms of like government funding, you need to do reports. And obviously with reports, there's audits. So there's that external pressure to make sure that you put more attention to that to, exhaust the funding, or else you might not get it back. And then we also touched a little bit on staffing turnover. That has, an impact internally within the organization.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Carol. And the one point I'll pick up on that you talked about and the other groups talked as well about all the sign-off points and some of the approvals that are needed as you move up through the organization. And as you correctly mentioned, the requirement for audits depending upon the flow of funding. For some flows of funding, you have audit requirements, you have performance and legal audits. I think that what that really speaks to is this balance that we're trying to find between the internal controls that are necessary to make sure that money is being spent as it's supposed to be spent. I reviewed a lot of audits, and whenever I see review audits, one of the most common material findings that I see is a lack of internal controls, because you want to have those internal controls in addition to your expenditure controls in order to be able to make sure that the money is being spent the way in which it needs to be spent. So there's a good reason why we have those controls and those checkoffs in place. But you have to balance that then with the downside, which is, again, what Merton tells us is institutional rigidity. It then slows everything down. It becomes frustrating for employees. It's harder for us to be adaptive and responsive to our environment when we have to have all these check-off points and all these points of signature and approval. So, that's kind of what we struggle with in the public sector and public organizations, trying to maintain that internal control while at the same time trying to be adaptive and responsive like some of our private sector counterparts. And that's oftentimes a difficult balance for us to maintain, and it can be frustrating. So, okay, very good. Again, I like when you see a lot of commonalities. I think that, the political aspect is certainly that was common across all the groups. But, hopefully what tonight will do is tonight will let us recognize how the external and the internal environment can really have an impact upon, again, how we define and how we measure effectiveness. So very good. Thank you very much for your work in the breakout groups. Thank you very much for being here this evening. Again, as we wrap it up tonight, make sure you get that background paper turned in if you haven't done so already by the end of tonight. Try and get those back to you by tomorrow. And then your Canvas essay for this week is just taking a distilled version of your background paper and then sharing that with your colleagues for your Canvas essay. All righty? Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. I hope everyone has a great week, and I'll get this recording up on our Canvas site as soon as I possibly can.
May I ask one question before you leave, Professor?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Real quick, I sent you an email about that. I wasn't able to come to the first two sessions because of work. Is there any particular format you want for the title page of the background paper?
No, just as long as you have your name on there, just have the name of the course and then your name on there. If you have a title for your paper, that's fine, but there's really no particular format for the title page.
Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you again next Monday.
Thank you.